This lecture will be devoted to the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. In particular, I want to look at Thomas's integrationism and specifically his 5 ways or proofs for the existence of God. Thomas lived between 1225 and 1274, at the heart of the Middle Ages. Not a very long life by modern standards, but nonetheless Thomas had a very productive life, both philosophically and theologically. Thomas was a Dominican friar. The Dominicans were an order within the Catholic Church, and during Thomas's lifetime, Aristotle was reintroduced into the Latin West. The reintroduction of Aristotle into the Latin West had a decisive influence on Thomas. One of his overall projects was to incorporate the philosophy of Aristotle with church theology to see if the two are compatible with one another. And we're going to look at that throughout this lecture. Thomas's most famous work is the Summa Theologica, a summary of theology. And it's from that work that we have our brief excerpt on Thomas's 5 ways in our textbook. I don't think it's a controversial statement to say that Thomas was the greatest medieval philosopher. In terms of intellect, production, and influence, no other medieval philosopher rivals Thomas in those 3 categories. In light of that, Thomas was canonized as a saint in the Catholic Church in 1323. Before looking at Thomas's philosophy, I want to give a brief recap of the theological controversy of the 13th century. Although we might not think the 13th century was a very exciting time, in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. The 13th century was a tumultuous time, not only in theological circles, but in philosophical circles as well. The reason why is that Aristotle's works had been reintroduced to the Latin West in the 1200s, and that created a crisis, both in theological circles and in philosophical circles. Prior to that reintroduction, Aristotle's works had been lost to the Latin West. If it were not for the Arabic philosophers, Aristotle, for the most part, would be lost to us today. When we think of Aristotle, we normally think of his metaphysics, or his Nicomachean ethics, or his politics, or physics. Those works had been lost prior to the 1200s in the Latin West, and were it not for Arabic philosophers who translated Aristotle and preserved his works, and ultimately reintroduced them to the Latin West, more than likely Aristotle would be lost today. That presented a crisis during Thomas's time. Namely, how does the Christian church respond to Aristotle? Aristotle, as we know from our studies, was an intellectual heavyweight. However, many of the doctrines and philosophies that he taught seemed to be incompatible with Christianity, with church teaching. For example, Aristotle taught the eternity of the universe, that the universe had always been here. And we know from our Sunday school lessons that the Bible teaches that God created the universe. Well, if Aristotle's teaching that the universe is eternal, and the Bible is teaching that the universe was created by God, there would seem to be a contradiction here. Or what about Aristotle's belief in the mortality of the soul? That the soul dies when the body dies. That would also seem to contradict Christian teaching that the human soul is immortal, and that once the body dies, the soul will exist in another life. Or how about Aristotle's natural science that neglected and even denied the supernatural? And of course, Aristotle's famous unmoved mover. The unmoved mover for Aristotle was an impersonal being. It's more of a metaphysical principle that he believed was required to explain the universe. But the unmoved mover wouldn't be a being that you would pray to or that you would worship. It's not a being that's concerned with how you live your life, ethically speaking. For Aristotle, it's more of a principle that he believed necessary in order to account for and ultimately explain the world. Well, that idea itself would seem to contradict Christianity's idea of a God who is concerned with morality and of a God who demands prayer and worship. So, how do we make sense of this? Well, during Thomas's time, this developed into a crisis, and there were a couple different schools of thought. On the one hand, you had the Latin Averroes, who were Latin followers of the Islamic philosopher Averroes. The Latin Averroes taught a double truth theory, and essentially what double truth theory means is that reason and philosophy can point to one truth, the Bible or revelation can point to another, and although these truths may contradict one another, they're really dealing with different realms. So science and reason can point to one truth, the Bible can point to another. Never mind if they contradict one another, somehow it's all going to work out in the end. Now that's kind of a caricature of that view, but essentially what the double truth theory held is that it's possible for the universe to be eternal, and science revealed that to us, and for the universe to be created, which is what the Bible reveals to us. However, such a theory St. Thomas thought nonsense about. St. Thomas wasn't satisfied with the double truth theory. So instead, he set out to create a grand synthesis of Aristotle and Catholic theology, or church theology. Aquinas is often seen as a great reconciler. He's trying to reconcile the teachings of Aristotle with the teachings of the Christian church. Now, it's important to note that Thomas made a clear distinction between philosophy and theology. He ultimately thought that there are different disciplines dealing with different objects and also dealing with different methods. For example, philosophy, and when I speak of philosophy, we can think of the sciences as well, relies solely on the natural light of reason, unassisted human reason. By unassisted human reason, Thomas means reason that has no other guide but itself. Reason not dependent on revelation to guide it. Theology, on the other hand, accepts a different principle. It has a different starting point, if you will. Theology rests on revealed authority, or faith. So one doesn't look to human reason when we're dealing with revealed authority or revealed faith. Instead, we look to that source of authority itself, whether it be the Bible or the church or a prophet. And it's held that that authority, whether it's the Bible, the church, or the prophet, will reveal truth to human beings. So whereas philosophy looks to reason, theology looks to revelation as the source of its authority. And we can think of this as two different starting points. The philosopher starts with the world of experience and argues by reason to God, while the theologian starts with God, as he has revealed himself. And from God, the theologian tries to understand the world, human beings, our meaning and purpose in the world, in light of revealed authority. So there's two different disciplines, if you will, for St. Thomas. We have philosophy and we have theology. However, for Thomas, philosophy and theology are not mutually exclusive disciplines.